Good evening, dear listeners. Dim the lights now, and let the quiet settle in. Let your body relax into the softness of your bed, your pillow cradling your head just so, as we travel ever so gently into the hushed, candlelit halls of history. Tonight, we're not visiting battlefields or grand coronations, nor are we chasing knights through muddy forests or sailing stormy seas. No, tonight we enter something more secretive, more curious, and perhaps a little bizarre. Tonight we drift into the peculiar world of ancient royal courts. Imagine a place where silence could mean power, where a single sneeze from the monarch might signal an omen, and where laughter could be as carefully timed as a chess move. Behind the heavy velvet curtains of palaces and fortresses, across empires from Persia to France, there were rituals, many of them deeply strange, that structured the lives of kings and queens, their servants, their spies, and their fools. Rituals that to us might seem ridiculous or wonderfully weird, but which once carried the weight of life, death, and legacy. You see, the court was not merely where a monarch lived. It was a theatre of power, a constant performance, where every gesture, every glance, every sip of wine had meaning. Royal courts were orchestrated to maintain mystery, to dazzle the eyes and confuse the enemies, and in doing so, they created customs so intricate and strange, they almost feel like a dream. Now a dream we'll wander through together tonight. Let us start with something simple. The act of walking. In many royal courts, walking was not a casual thing. The monarch did not merely stroll across a room. No, they glided. Behind them, sometimes inches behind, courtier would hold their train, eyes downcast. To walk before the monarch was a privilege. In Versailles, it was called marcher devant le roi, and only a few were permitted to do so. And even then, one could not simply walk normally. Every movement had to be graceful, slow, deliberate. After all, royalty did not hurry. Time itself waited for kings. And then there was the royal waking ceremony. Yes, in some courts, the act of waking the king was more than just knocking on a door. It was a ritual known in the court of Louis XIV as the lever du roi. The day began with layers of ceremony. Dozens of nobles filing in to watch, one by one, as the king was awakened, washed and dressed. First came the Grand Chamberlain, then the royal barber, then a bishop to offer a blessing. Eventually, the highest-ranking noble was allowed the immense honor of helping the king put on his shoe. One shoe, not both. That would be presumptuous. Imagine rising each morning with 40 people waiting to watch you comb your hair. Now imagine those people fighting behind the scenes for the privilege to do it. And it wasn't just in France. In Ming Dynasty China, the emperor's day began with a long, rhythmic chant performed by eunuchs and astrologers, setting the cosmic tone for everything to follow. In the Mughal courts of India, musicians would perform at dawn outside the emperor's sleeping quarters to gently wake him with melody. All of this was designed to remind everyone who held power not just through words, but through ceremony. Power was not simply held by it was performed. Now, consider the meals. Meals in royal courts were not for nourishment. They were for spectacle. Dining halls glimmered with gold, silver, and on special occasions even plates made from sugar. In the Ottoman Empire, food prepared for the Sultan passed through 7 layers of inspection. A team of eunuchs and tasters tested each dish for poison. If a dish made it to the Sultan's table, it had essentially survived a small army. And still, he might not eat it. In England, elaborate rules governed who could eat what and where. At banquets, the seating chart was a political map. The closer you sat to the king, the more important you were. But beware the man who reached for food before the monarch had taken a bite. It was considered not just rude but an offense toward itself. Now let us wander a little further through these polished marble corridors, where the scent of beeswax polish mingles with rose water. Step quietly, for behind these doors, life unfolds, not in chaos, but in choreography, an endless dance of manners, traditions, and unspoken laws. In ancient Japan, during the Heian period, the imperial court took refinement to extremes. Every moment, every letter, every conversation was steeped in poetic formality. A courtier would not say, "I miss you." Instead, they might pen a verse about the scent of a withering blossom. Clothing had to match not only the season, but the mood of the day. Sleeves were measured, layered, scented. Even the rustle of silk could be judged a good rustle was admired. Too loud, and you risked disgrace. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, the emperors wrapped themselves in a web of ceremonial splendor so intricate that no one truly knew where the man ended and the office began. The imperial thronius, it was gilded, but more than that. It could move, it could rise, mechanically, on hidden pulleys, lifting the emperor above his petitioners, as if he were ascending to heaven. Gilded lions flanked the throne and could roar at will, powered by clever contraptions. Imagine stepping forward to plead your case and being met with a mechanical growl from a golden beast, its jeweled eyes flashing. No word was spoken, but the message was clear. You are in the presence of something more than human. This blending of fear, reverence, and theatricality was deliberate. Courts were always stages. Kings, queens, and emperors were the actors, and their power was amplified by how convincingly they played their roles. But not all peculiar customs were quite so grand. Let's turn to the tiny kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the Pyrenees. Here, for centuries, it was law that whenever the king entered a village, the villagers had to roll out a red carpet, made not of cloth but of flowers. Every step was to be softened by petals gathered at dawn. The practice continued long after it was practical, long after anyone remembered why it began, because tradition in the royal court had a power all its own, and all the rules. You mustn't turn your back to the king. Unless you were the royal jester, only the jester had the rare and dangerous privilege of mocking the monarch, and even then, with care, a wrong joke at the wrong moment could end not in laughter but in exile, or worse. Yet the jester's role was vital. They were truth-tellers in disguise, cloaked in bells and foolishness. Their presence was a pressure valve, allowing uncomfortable truths to be aired under the mask of even how one looked at the monarch mattered. In Ethiopia's imperial court, subjects were expected to cover their mouths in the presence of the emperor because to breathe the same air was an honor too great. In some courts of Africa and India, the ruler might appear behind a screen, unseen, their presence sensed but not directly viewed. To see the sovereign was a gift, not a right. But beyond the dazzling halls and golden thrones, behind the embroidered curtains and perfumed fans, were the people, the servants, the advisers, the whisperers. Royal life was filled with watchers. The lady-in-waiting, who knew which perfume the queen wore each day. The page, who noticed the prince's limp before the court physicians did. The eunuch, who carried secrets from one chamber to the next. The court was not just about ceremony. It was about information, about survival. In the Mughal court, for example, spies were dressed as musicians, cooks, even flower-bearers. They moved freely, ears open, mouths shut, feeding the emperor a steady diet of whispered truths. If a noble was plotting rebellion, the emperor knew before breakfast. If a merchant dared insult a prince, word travelled faster than the wind. This atmosphere of surveillance created customs that seem bizarre to us now but made perfect sense then. In Spain, under Philip II, courtiers were not allowed to knock on the king's door. Instead, they scratched. Gently, silently, a polite whisper against the wood, so as not to startle His Majesty. A whole language of etiquette developed around how to request entrance. 1. Scratch for a letter. 2. For news. 3. For the royal physician. Even sleep, the most private of acts, was ceremonial. In the court of the French Bourbons, it was said that a duchess never truly undressed. Nightgowns were adorned with lace and pearls. Bed linens were embroidered with family crests. And when a royal couple retired for the night, it might be witnessed by several members of the court to confirm. You see that a legitimate heir was being conceived. Privacy was a modern invention. In the royal courts of old, intimacy was often a performance. And so, customs bloomed bizarre, beautiful, or both. The Russian Tsars, for instance, had a curious method of matchmaking. Eligible brides were summoned to the court in droves, paraded before the monarch like a living catalogue. But before any decision was made, they were tested not just for beauty, but for bloodline, breath, even the brightness of their eyes. The chosen girl might find herself crowned empress one morning and imprisoned the next, should politics shift overnight. In some African kingdoms, the royal stool was sacred. No one could sit in the king's seat, not even the king, unless the right incantations had been spoken. The stool was believed to house the soul of the nation, and if it was stolen, chaos would follow. In medieval England, the coronation spoon used to anoint the monarch was treated with such reverence. It was stored in a locked chest within the Tower of London, not because it was valuable in gold, but because it was valuable in meaning. It symbolized divine rights, the idea that a king was chosen not by people, but by God, a spoon, carrying the weight of heaven. Now, as the candles flicker lower and your eyes grow heavy, let's take a moment to listen to the hush within the palace walls. A hush that has outlived empires. The echo of rules followed so precisely they became absurd. The echo of a whisper at court. The Queen has changed her ribbon color. What could it mean? Because in the world of royalty, everything meant something. Every step, every garment, every silence, even a sneeze. Yes, let's not forget the tale of King Henry II of France, who believed that sneezing in court without covering one's nose was an omen of betrayal. Or the Persian Shah who wore his beard braided not for fashion, but because he believed it channeled wisdom from the heavens. Or the Egyptian pharaohs who dined alone, in silence, believing that conversation diluted the divine purity of their meals. Let's linger a while longer in that royal chamber, where the first breath of morning still feels sacred, and ceremony lingers like the scent of warmed oils. These wakeful rituals, strange as they may seem now, were more than habits. They were deeply rooted affirmations of divine order, a reminder that even something as private as waking was, in the world of royalty, a performance for history. And yet, it wasn't only the kings who were stirred to life with reverence. Queens had their own versions of the awakening, often layered with both privilege and scrutiny. Take, for instance, the queens of England or France. Their chambers were slightly more secluded than the king's, yet equally populated with ladies-in-waiting, governesses, and favoured attendants. Their morning might begin with whispered prayers, the unbraiding of hair, and a delicate choice of which jewelled headdress best suited the day astute is an act, not of vanity, but of visible symbolism. The presence of witnesses was part of the pageantry. There was power in being seen, even in moments of vulnerability. Every ring slipped onto a finger, every braid woven into golden tresses, these were coded gestures in a political ballet. Attendants didn't just serve. They observed, memorized, whispered. The Queen's sigh might be interpreted as melancholy, her laughter as triumph. Gossip could bloom like frost across a garden wall before noon had struck. Now picture a morning deep in winter. Snow muffles the courtyard outside, but inside the royal bedchamber it is warm with the glow of hearth and ceremony. The steward arrives with a fur-lined robe. A favourite hound, trained in quiet companionship, curls at the foot of the bed. Somewhere down the corridor, trumpeters are rehearsing the morning fanfare for courtly breakfast. And all the while, the monarch's awakening is being documented in silence, not with ink, but with glances, with the hush of ritual. In the court of Philip the Good of Burgundy, even the act of donning a slipper was part of protocol. The right foot first, always. It was said that misplacing a shoe before the left foot was touched brought misfortune. Such was the delicate superstition of the time, a blend of routine and reverence. One foot out of order, and the cosmos itself might sigh. Then there were the roles assigned to attendant. The groom of the stool, in Tudor England, for instance, had perhaps the most bizarre and intimate task of all. Assisting the king in his most private of needs, but far from being a lowly post, it was one of great prestige. The groom had access to the king when few others did. In the quiet moments between waking and court, he might whisper counsel, hear frustrations, even influence policy. In the royal ecosystem, proximity was power, even if it came with rather unusual duties. As the day bloomed outside those stone walls, the court itself would begin to stir. But no one truly acted until the monarch had risen. Servants waited to hear the first footsteps echo down the corridor. Chamber musicians readied gentle melodies to accompany the monarch's procession to morning prayer or breakfast. And somewhere, in the kitchens below, the morning meal was being arranged, sometimes with elaborate ceremony of its own. For certain kings, like those in the Holy Roman Empire, meals were as symbolic as they were nourishing. A boiled egg or a honey-dipped fig might be presented with a scroll of scripture. The food was blessed, tasted for poison, and arranged according to tradition. And just as the body had awakened, so too did the kingdom around it, step by ceremonial step. Outside of Western Europe, similar reverence-colored royal awakenings. In Byzantine courts, elaborate rituals involving incense, gilded robes, and iconography marked the emperor's first moments of the day. In the Islamic courts of Damascus, rulers might be greeted with poetry and incense, softening the passage from sleep to sovereignty with fragrance and verse. Even in medieval Ethiopia, emperors were often awakened with prayer chants and sacred drumming, a rhythm meant to mirror the pulse of divine life. The ritual of rising, then, was not confined by geography. It was a near-universal idea among those who ruled, that the body of the monarch was not simply human, but a sacred vessel whose awakening deserved choreography. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, beneath all that ritual, how did it feel? Was there ever a morning when a monarch simply wanted to sleep a little longer, to dismiss the steward, wave away the robes, and linger in dreams? Was there a moment when even a king wished for privacy, for the kind of morning where the only audience was the birdsong outside the window? Perhaps, But history left little room for such indulgences. To be royal was to be seen was to perform, and performance began, always, with the rising, the most curious part. These routines didn't just benefit the ruler, they offered stability to everyone around them. In a world often uncertain, the sight of a monarch rising on schedule eating bread, sipping spiced wine, petting a lapdog, was its own kind of reassurance. The kingdom was intact. The sun still rose. The monarch still reigned. Even court jesters, whose role it was to entertain, sometimes observed the royal rising. It was believed that laughter in the morning could balance the king's humours, preventing melancholy. A light joke whispered behind a hand-painted fan, or a gentle pun over a cup of clove-infused tea, might be the first sound of the ruler's day. And so the performance continued. Every lace tied, every candle lit, every title announced it, all fed into the great script of monarchy. The audience, God, subjects, servants, and history itself. By the time the monarch stepped beyond the chamber door and composed, the court was already in motion, like a wind-up machine ready to hum into its next scene. And now, as we draw the curtains once more, we leave the ruler standing in morning light, a silhouette cast by stained glass windows. The slippers are tied, the prayers said, the scrolls delivered. It is day once more in the palace, and with it the quiet dignity of ritual fulfilled. Let the footsteps echo softly behind you as we leave that room. Let the golden dust dance in shafts of sunlight through high stone windows, and remember, whether king or queen, prince or attendant mourning in a medieval court was never just a beginning. It was a performance, a rite, and a reminder that even in waking, royalty was never truly alone. Imagine, if you will, the long, echoing corridors of a royal palace just before dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls softly, not to announce war or worship, but to signal the start of something far more indulgent, a royal feast, and not just any feast, but one draped in ceremony, excess, and at times strangeness. You and I are not mere observers tonight. We'll sit quietly at the edges of courts from different corners of history, peeking into their most curious meals, their oddest customs, and their most lavish spreads. In the medieval courts of France and Burgundy, for example, a banquet was never simply about food. It was a test of power, status, and spectacle. And though a steaming pot of broth might not sound remarkable, when poured from a golden pitcher by a servant clad in ermine into a porcelain bowl shaped like a lion's mouth, the experience became something entirely otherworldly. Food was not just nourishment, it was theatre. Imagine tables that stretched for yards, piled with dozens upon dozens of dishes, some of which were never intended to be eaten at all. Entire boars glazed in honey and spiced with saffron were paraded whole, their tusks decorated with silk ribbons. Swans were cooked, then carefully redressed in their own feathered skins, their beaks dipped in gold leaf. Peacocks, too, were roasted and then recloaked, as if rising from the flames like mythic phoenixes. But no one dared touch them. These were symbols, not sustenance. The food itself was art. The purpose, the more extravagant the dish, the more divine the host appeared. Monarchs, after all, were believed to be chosen by God. What better way to remind your guests of your near-divine status than to serve fish moulded to resemble dragons, or pies that, when sliced open, released live birds that fluttered toward the chandeliers? A banquet could blur the line between marvel and madness, But excess came with its own set of rules so meticulous and rigid that entire books were written to help courtiers navigate them. In the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV, even lifting the wrong utensil at the wrong time could mark you as uncultured. There were designated moments to sip your wine, to dab your lips, to begin and end your course. Servants didn't just bring food, they observed your every move. To scratch one's nose with the wrong hand, to glance at a dish before the king had tasted histies were offences, albeit quiet ones. Yet, while etiquette was public, the taboos of the table were often deeply private. Certain foods were believed to stir the body in dangerous ways. Garlic, onions, and spicy herbs were in some courts forbidden not because of scent, but of superstition. They were thought to provoke lust. In some monastic banquets, yes, even monks feasted meat was avoided altogether on certain days, not for health, but to keep the desires of the flesh at bay. One could never underestimate the politics of seating, either. In the Ottoman palace at Topkapi, hierarchy dictated everything, even the angle of one's spoon. Only the Sultan ate from solid gold. His mother, slightly lower, dined with silver. The further one sat from the central table, the plainer the dishes became, descending in both flavour and finery. A man might spend his entire life currying favour not just for land or title, but for the chance to move a seat or two closer to power and a better slice of lamb. In China's imperial court, meals could include over 100 dishes, but only a few bites were consumed from each. Every course, from turtle soup to sugared rose petals, reflected not just culinary taste, but cosmic balance. Harmony of yin and yang played out in ginger, ginseng, and even goose liver. Before tasting, the emperor's food was sampled by servants, not simply to assess flavor, but to test for poison. Each bite became an act of trust. Not all strange customs were elegant. In the royal courts of England, during the Tudor period, jesters were allowed to interrupt feasts with riddles, tricks, or biting commentary. Sometimes they disguised themselves as servants, hiding beneath tables or swapping salt for sugar. Though the feast was formal, laughter, even chaos, had a place. It reminded everyone, perhaps, that beneath their crowns and corsets, royals were still human. Let us pause for a moment and imagine one particularly strange custom from a Bavarian court. Once a year, during Lent, a banquet was held where no one could speak. Even as roasted hare was passed hand to hand, even as wine spilled and spoons clinked, absolute silence reigned. Each gesture had to be exaggerated, nod for thanks, a raised brow for displeasure. It was a meal of gesture, ritual, and solemn reflection, a feast without words, where the very absence of sound became part of the flavor. And then there were the foods themselves, oddities, not just by modern standards, but even to their contemporaries. In Denmark, goose feet, stuffed with almonds and boiled in honey, were prized delicacies. In Sicily, a fish bladder jelly was flavored with rose water, and in some Middle Eastern courts, guests were given chilled drinks, thickened with tree resin and dusted with powdered pearl. Even drinks could be peculiar. Mead and ale, of course, flowed freely, but some courts mixed alcohol with crushed emeralds or ruby dust, believing that such precious stones could protect against poison or extend youth. A sip of wine might become a magical act. A toast might serve as both blessing and spell. In some parts of medieval Europe, certain banquets were closed by a peculiar ritual known as the digestive march. Guests, overly full, would be led around gardens by musicians to help digestion. Picture noble women in stiff bodices strolling in a circle, flanked by flutes and soft drums. their silks rustling like wind through a tapestry. The meal did not end at the table, it extended into movement, music, and air. Then there were dishes so rare that their arrival caused silence to fall. In the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, there existed a preparation called sugar-baked parrot. The bird was stuffed with saffron and pistachios, encased in sugar crust, and baked until golden. Not everyone could eat it. It was reserved for a select few chosen by merit, favor, or mystery. Receiving a piece was a gesture, a political sign, a promise, or a warning. Some meals weren't eaten at all. In Korean royal courts, elaborate trays of food were placed before deceased monarchs on certain anniversaries, each dish symbolizing memory, loyalty, or regret. Food as offering, food as history, food as language between worlds. And yet, for all the rules and ceremonies, mistakes happened. Once, during a French court banquet, a newly appointed nobleman mistakenly drank from the king's goblet. Silence fell. Eyes turned. Punishment hovered. But the king, amused, raised an eyebrow and declared that it was a sign of shared fate. He ordered new goblets for all, and had the entire feast restarted from soup to nuts. As we drift now toward the end of our time at the table, you might wonder, why so much drama for dinner? Why so many strange customs, unspoken laws, and symbolic courses? Because in ancient courts, food wasn't just survival, it was a language, a dialect of power, ritual, beauty, and belief. A dinner could charm an enemy, elevate a friend, or cement a legacy. Even the strangeness had purpose. Let these old feasts stay with you like a quiet flavor on the tongue, honey and saffron, laughter and silence, silk and bone. In the world of royal courts, every plate told a story. And that story, like the echo of a lute after the last note, still lingers. Let your mind now wander again past the herbal corridors and strange, surgical chambers of our previous journey into something more delicate, yet no less peculiar, the world of royal love and marriage, or rather, the game of it, because for the kings and queens of old, love was rarely a private thing. It was a spectacle, a performance, a kind of high-stakes theatre where the curtains never quite closed and everyone, from courtiers to clergy, seemed to have a front-row seat. Imagine, if you will, the heavy hush of a castle-esque great whole-cold stone walls, adorned with tapestries depicting mythical lovers and divine unions. Candles flicker as whispers rustle like silk across the floor. A royal wedding is at hand. But before the lovers exchange vows, before the feast is laid, and certainly before any private consummation, there are rules. Many rules. Some strange, some sacred, all meticulously crafted to ensure that Lviv, we can even call it, that served the throne first and the heart second. Let us begin, curiously enough, with the Tudors. Ah, yes, the Tudors rarely a quiet bunch. Beneath the polished surface of their ceremonies lay customs that now seem impossibly strange. You might have heard of Henry VIII, a man whose love life could fuel 1,000 bedtime tailies. But what you may not know is what happened on the wedding night of a Tudor monarch. This was no private affair, no candles blown out behind a bolted door. Instead, a most curious ritual unfolded. After the wedding feast, when bellies were full and wine had loosened tongues, the newlyweds were led to their bedchamber by a procession of lords and ladies. The couple, still dressed in their ornate wedding garments, were undressed not by each other, but by attendants. Imagine that. The bride, her dress loosened by ladies in waiting. The groom, assisted by groomsmen, all ceremonial, all supervised. Then the witnesses. Yes, witnesses. Trusted courtiers, bishops, and noble elders remained in the room as the royal pair climbed into bed. Sometimes curtains were drawn, sometimes not. Sometimes the observers waited until the pair had settled under the sheets before departing. But not always. There are records polite, vague, often too polite, hinting that the consummation itself was partially witnessed, or at the very least, immediately inspected afterward for signs that the union had indeed been, shall we say, sealed. This wasn't voyeurism, it was politics. A royal marriage wasn't just personal, it was public. It bound to dynasties, secured inheritance, and stabilized kingdoms. The legitimacy of future heirs depended on this moment. If the marriage was not consummated, it could be and so the witnesses came. There's something surreal about this, isn't there? Love reduced to a checklist. Intimacy turned into theatre. And yet, this was the reality for many royal houses. Duty and desire were never separate. They were entangled in silk sheets and sealed by protocol. But this wasn't just an English eccentricity. No, let's travel eastward. Picture now, if you will, the hallowed stillness of a Japanese imperial court. The rituals here were quieter, more spiritual, but no less complex. In medieval Japan, marriage among the nobility was governed by a mixture of Shinto tradition and aristocratic formality. An imperial bride, often chosen for her bloodline more than her beauty, might meet her groom for the first time on the wedding night itself. And yet, before she could be declared fit to become a wife, especially to someone of the imperial line, she might undergo a form of examination, not always clinical, but certainly invasive by modern standards. Matrons of the court, experienced older women, would examine the young woman's body for signs of health, fertility, and purity, her skin, her hair, her demeanor. In some cases, it was believed that a woman's spiritual energy could be gauged by how she carried herself, how her presence felt in a room. Once deemed suitable, the ceremony could proceed. But even this was subtle. A marriage might be marked not by vows, but by a shared night. If the groom returned 3 nights in a row, the union was considered sealed. If he did not, the woman's standing could be called into question. Again, not love as we understand it, but a system of appearances, of traditions laced with symbolism and silence. And what of the union itself? There were rituals for that too. Offerings to kami divine spirits were made. The bedchamber was prepared with care, and household members performed blessings to protect the union from misfortune. Here, too, the private was always shaped by the public. But let us go back even further now. Far before the Tudors, before the rise of European courts, let us enter the sun-baked lands of ancient Mesopotamia, where a tradition existed that many would now find both fascinating and unfathomable. Here, marriage especially sacred, marriage could involve more than 2 individuals. In the great cities of Sumer, there were temples, and in those temples, not just nuns of silence, but women of status, trained in sacred rites, including what came to be known as the sacred marriage ceremony. In this rite, the king would symbolically marry the goddess in a goddess of love, fertility, and war. But Inanna did not appear herself. Instead, her presence was channeled through a high priestess. Yes, you heard that correctly. The king, in a ritual drenched in symbolism and incense, would unite with a priestess in a ceremonial act meant to bless the land, ensure harvest, and confirm divine favor. It was political, It was spiritual, and it was entirely accepted. The priestess, far from being shamed, was honored. Her role was essential in connecting the earthly realm with the heavens. She was Inanna, if only for a night. The ceremony was detailed in hymns, recorded in cuneiform, and chanted aloud in sacred precincts. It was believed that the union brought fertility not just to the womb, but to the soil, the herds, the rivers. What a contrast this is, where intimacy was not hidden, not policed by bishops or court officials, but elevated as a cosmic act. And in between these extremes, between the silent nights of Kyoto and the chanted rituals of Uru, we find still more strangeness. In some parts of medieval Europe, before a royal bride could be married, her virginity had to be confirmed. By whom? Not a physician, but often by older noblewomen. These examinations again, often ceremonial, sometimes symbolic, or about protecting lineage. The crown could not risk a scandal. If a bride was found lacking, rumors could spread. An alliance could crumble. Wars could erupt. So intense was the focus on heirs and lineage that even the possibility of infertility was grounds for a woman unable to bear children could be discarded, her body deemed unsuitable for the royal project. Fertility wasn't just desirable, it was political currency. And yet, despite all this performance, all this scrutiny, real love sometimes bloomed. There are quiet records of kings who adored their queens, of queens who found tenderness amid the harshness of their roles, letters, poems, fleeting moments when love, real love, flickered in a world built on duty. Courtly love, often associated with knights, serenading ladies, existed too. But it was more fantasy than reality, a code of behavior, a game of unfulfilled longing, songs sung to unattainable women, love as metaphor, desire restrained, all designed to stir the heart without ever quite satisfying it. And so the royal bed became a battlefield not of lust, but of lineage, not of pleasure, but of politics. Every sigh, every union, every whispered word between sheets could echo across empires. In our world, love is often private, but in theirs, it was performed, recorded, witnessed, even judged. Imagine falling in love under such conditions. Or imagine trying to find something real in a world where everything, even the most intimate act, was watched. As you settle deeper into your pillows now, let the bizarre elegance of these customs lull you into stillness. The flickering candlelight of royal chambers, the whispered instructions of court matrons, the ancient hymns of temple priestesses, all layered into a single truth. That love, in all its forms, be it sacred, strategic, or sincerely felt, has always found a way to slip through the cracks of tradition. And with that thought, let your mind rest. In the stillness of the stone-walled great halls, beneath the flickering light of hundreds of beeswaxed candles, history's royal courts prepared for one of their most sacred and most dangerous rituals. The feast. It was a time when platters groaned under the weight of roasted game, spices perfumed the air, and velvet-draped nobles whispered behind jeweled goblets. But behind every clink of silver and every hearty toast was a layer of tension, because, in royal courts, food was never just food. It was spectacle, status, ceremony, and sometimes a weapon. Imagine sitting in the high-vaulted banquet room of a medieval palace. Servants shuffle across the floor, their soft slippers silencing each step. Gold-embellished tapestries watch, like witnesses from the walls, and the long oak table before you stretches endlessly into the shadows. At the head of the table sits the king, calm, composed, and perhaps only slightly paranoid. Every dish placed before him has been tasted, every sip of wine scrutinized. Because in this world, poison wasn't the stuff of fantasy. It was a legitimate, calculated threat. To dine in royalty's presence was to witness a performance centuries in the making. Banquets weren't mere meals, they were orchestrations of hierarchy, loyalty, and fear. In the court of Henry VIII, for instance, elaborate menus were carefully curated not only for taste, but to reflect the king's power. Entire peacocks were served, refeathered, with their heads mounted in place, golden beaks gleaming. Dishes came in odd shapes, sugar castles, gelatin, swans, roast boar with glinting tusks, and everything glittered with costly spices like saffron, cloves, and cinnamon, each one rarer than gold in some parts of Europe. But let us linger a moment on one role that sat closest to the crown, the royal food taster, a job both prestigious and perilous. These brave souls were tasked with eating a portion of every royal dish before it reached the king's lips. If the food was safe, the monarch dined in peace. If not, well, it's fair to say there weren't many long retirements in that line of work. Poison was a real and ever-present concern in royal courts across Europe and Asia alike. The Borgia family in Renaissance Italy, with their whispered tales of secret toxins, became the very embodiment of poisoned politics. But even earlier, in the Byzantine court, emperors surrounded themselves with apothecaries and personal chefs who doubled as chemists studying antidotes, tracing the origins of every ingredient, even tasting the well water for signs of tampering. In France, the Sun King Louis XIV was known for his extravagant feasts, sometimes lasting several hours and involving hundreds of dishes. But no matter how lavish the menu, there was always a shadow of concern. Servants employed in the royal kitchens underwent background checks. Silverware and serving dishes were polished and inspected, not only for cleanliness, but for signs of foreign substances. Even herbs like parsley or sage, if added improperly or from unknown sources, could spark suspicion. Of course, suspicion bred its own rituals. Some monarchs, especially in Eastern courts, adopted elaborate routines to avoid becoming predictable targets. Ivan the Terrible of Russia was so distrustful of his own kitchen staff that he maintained multiple dining rooms across different residences and often dined alone. Watched by a retinue of guards, his personal taster had to consume not just a bite of each dish, but the water he drank, the wine he sipped, and even the wax used to seal his letters. And in the Ottoman Empire, sultans took a similar approach. Their meals were prepared in secure, guarded kitchens by a small team of trusted eunuchs, and dishes were sealed and labeled before being delivered. It wasn't uncommon for a sultan to eat from a different plate than the one served, swapping at the last moment, just in case. But it wasn't always fear that shaped royal feasting. There was also fantasy and theatricality. In the court of Catherine de' Medici, Italian chefs introduced new forms of sugar art to France, crafting edible sculptures that mimicked marble and metal. Guests at her feasts often found themselves staring into the eyes of life-size sugar lions, or cutting into pies that erupted with live songbirds, a spectacle borrowed from earlier medieval traditions. One famous banquet offered a castle made entirely of cold meat, flanked by knights sculpted from butter. Let's not forget the coded messages hidden in food. In some royal courts, the dishes themselves delivered meaning. A cherry tart sent to a queen might signal desire. A roast quail could suggest peace or submission, depending on the context. In the more secretive circles of the Chinese imperial court, messages were hidden beneath tea leaves, or inscribed with syrup onto rice, wafers so subtle that only the intended recipient would know they received a message at all. Yet no matter how elaborate or symbolic, every feast carried the undercurrent of danger. Because to be a royal was to be a target, poison wasn't always used to kill. Sometimes it was meant to sicken, to weaken, to cast doubt. Rumors of poisoning could unseat ministers, ruin alliances, even spark wars. That's why antidotes were as prized as spices. Kings and queens collected them, wore them, even consumed small doses of certain toxins in hopes of building resistance, a practice called Mithridatism, named after Mithridates VI of Pontus, who was said to have ingested poison daily until he became immune. Imagine a velvet pouch hanging from a queen's waist knot filled with coins, but with powdered bezoar stone, believed to neutralize any poison, or a ring with a secret compartment of ground unicorn, horner, mythical substance, treasured as the ultimate safeguard. These beliefs might sound fanciful now, but in the context of medieval courts, they were forms of armor, as essential as a suit of mail or a fortress wall. And speaking of belief, let's not overlook the spiritual dimensions of food and poison. The line between the two wasn't always clear. A food might be considered cursed, especially if consumed during certain lunar alignments or feast days. A servant might be accused of poisoning a dish, not because they added anything, but because they harbored impure thoughts while preparing it. Spiritual cleanliness mattered as much as physical purity. Some courts employed not only tasters, but astrologers to determine auspicious times for banquets. A feast hosted under the wrong star could spell disaster. In the Ming court of China, certain emperors refused to eat anything that hadn't been blessed by a temple monk or passed through incense smoke. In medieval Germany, royal bread was sometimes sliced crosswise to release spirits before it touched the royal lips. There's even record of magical foods used as love charms, as weapons of seduction. In Renaissance Venice, for example, powdered Spanish fly-an, infamous aphrodisiac and dangerous toxin, was occasionally rumored to be slipped into wine at noble weddings. The effects were unpredictable, the outcomes sometimes deadly. Of course, in the quieter wings of the palace, food could be comfort. Royal physicians often prescribed certain meals to calm anxiety or soothe digestion. Almond milk soups, lightly sweetened with honey, were a favorite of nervous monarchs. Spiced wine diluted with water and warmed was thought to ease melancholia, and roasted apples gently blistered over an open fire were fed to kings convalescing from both illness and heartbreak. So as we continue wandering the winding corridors of royal life, think of those banquet halls not just as places of indulgence, but as battlefields and theaters, confession chambers and traps. Every course carried the possibility of celebration or sabotage. Let your thoughts settle now like falling breadcrumbs. Picture the long tables emptied, candles extinguished, and only the scent of rosemary and roast lingering in the cool air. The hall is quiet. The danger has passed, at least for tonight, and in that silence, another story waits to be served. In the world of royal courts, authority was never just inherited, was staged, ritualized, and sanctified in performances of great detail. Monarchs weren't simply rulers. They were actors in a sacred play, one that unfolded in churches, palaces, and open squares before the eyes of courtiers and commoners alike, to maintain their hold on power. Kings and queens didn't just sit on thrones, they became thrones. Living symbols meant to embody divine order on earth. and so their lives were woven with customs, many of them strange, layered in symbolism, and heavy with centuries of sacred tradition. Take, for instance, the coronation. It wasn't merely a crowning, it was an initiation. In medieval England and France, the ritual closely mirrored a religious sacrament. The monarch-to-be was stripped of secular clothing, clothed in plain linen, and anointed with holy oil on the head, chest, and hands, not with casual dabs, but with solemn intention, each touch signaling that the person was now consecrated, spiritually transformed. The oil wasn't just oil, it was the same substance used in baptisms, believed to carry the blessing of divine right. This act whispered to the world, this body, this ruler, is now more than flesh. This is a vessel of the sacred. And the robe, richly dyed in purple or crimson, trimmed with fur, often bearing embroidered stars, lions, or crosses. It was far more than clothing. Each layer said something. Velvet for wealth, fur for dominion over nature, gold for heaven's favor. In the Byzantine Empire, emperors wore garments stitched with imagery of Christ and angels, as if wrapping themselves in visible divinity. Every thread, every jewel, was political theatre. Foot washing, another curious royal ritual, might seem humble. Yet, in the context of court, it was calculated humility. On Maundy Thursday, some kings and queens especially, in Christian Europe, the feet of the poor. But this wasn't merely an act of charity, it was spectacle. Monarchs were surrounded by bishops, heralds, and often dozens of carefully selected paupers who had been cleaned and prepped for the ceremony. There was incense, chanting, a flurry of symbolic hand gestures. The monarch would kneel, wash, and even kiss the feet. The gesture said, "I am a servant to my people," but the staging said, "And look how grand I am while doing it." Sometimes the rituals took stranger turns. In ancient Ethiopia, emperors were forbidden from touching the ground with bare feet. Their connection to the earth had to be mediated through special sandals or carpets. The divine spark within them be contaminated by mortal soil. In Japan's imperial court, sacred rituals included days of fasting before important festivals, with the emperor isolated in purity, tended to only by selected priests and priestesses who themselves had been ritually cleansed. Then there were acts of public power designed not just to impress, but to intimidate. Consider the royal touch, a custom in which English and French monarchs claimed the ability to heal scrofular disfiguring skin diseased by merely laying hands upon the afflicted. The patients would line up by the hundreds. The king would move slowly, deliberately, placing fingers or palms upon sores, murmuring blessings, and sometimes pressing a coin into the patient's hand. It was medicine as monarchy, the body politic healing the body physical, and it worked at least in the minds of the people, who often wept with gratitude and went away believing they had brushed against holiness. In Russia, Tsars engaged in rituals meant to reflect celestial order. During coronation, they would pass beneath 7 archways draped in silky charch, representing one of the biblical virtues. They'd be handed the orb and scepter in a cross pattern, symbolizing east and west, the sun and the moon, the balance of masculine and feminine forces. In divine rule, everything had meaning. Nothing was random. Even silence had purpose in royal ritual. In some Chinese dynasties, emperors would enter ceremonies flanked by dozens of silent, barefoot attendants who never spoke or met anyone's eyes. They represented the void, the invisible structure of the cosmos. The emperor, gleaming in dragon silk, moved through the silence like a god in mist. The message was unmistakable. He was the axis of heaven and earth. Back in medieval Europe, processions were another realm of symbolic power. The king or queen didn't walk, no. They processed, slowly, with head held high, surrounded by banners and incense, with musicians playing melodies composed centuries before. Each step was deliberate. Even the path itself was chosen for meaning, across bridges representing passage into new eras, or through ancient gates that echoed older, mythic conquests. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's appearance was rare and choreographed. When he did appear, it was behind gilded screens, and his gestures were few but potent. A simple nod could free a prisoner or condemn a traitor. A smile could elevate a servant to vizier. And when he appeared in full ceremonial armor, not for war, but for feast, it was to declare strength, resolve, and the indelible connection between bloodline and empire. Colors were coded to blue was often reserved for divine connection, worn during rituals of fertility or celestial invocation. White was for death, but also purity, hence its use in royal mourning. As with Anne of Brittany, who wore pure white after the death of her children, red, especially deep crimson, symbolized sacrifice, courage, and Christ's blood. Wearing it wasn't just stylish, it was a sermon in silk. Royal baptisms, even those of infants, became rituals of state. In France, the Le Grand Baptême involved silver basins of sacred water, musicians hidden behind tapestries, and gowns passed down from Charlemagne's court. These moments didn't just welcome new life. They announced future authority. Gestures had rules too. A bowed head could be treason if done without protocol. An extended hand might signal a plea or a threat. In Elizabethan England, the Queen's gloved hand was considered too holy to touch. Subjects kissed the air near it. In Versailles, a misstep in etiquette, failing to bow the right number of times, could end a courtier's career. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs performed the said festival, a ritual of rejuvenation that symbolically renewed their power. It included running a course, wearing multiple crowns, and reciting lines meant to rebind the cosmos. The idea to remind the universe that the king was not just mortal, but the living Horus. Sometimes, these rituals were less about public display, and more about private symbolism. In Scandinavian courts, kings kept shrines to Odin or Christian saints in their private chambers. They'd touch amulets, whisper prayers, or light candles before making royal decisions. Their authority wasn't just politically, was entangled with invisible forces, and behind every ritual lay a deep, driving fear that without these performances, everything could unravel. The divine right might slip. The people might doubt. The world might crack at its seams. So every gesture mattered. Every feather in the headdress. Every word spoken aloud, in the right tone, at the right time. Every cloak lifted. Every footstep echoed in the marble halls. These were not just traditions, they were enchantments, designed to hold kingdoms together, with silk and oil, with breath and bone. As the candlelight fades a little more, and your breath grows slower, picture these monarchs wrapped in gold, drenched in incense, performing slow, mystical dances of power, each movement echoing across centuries. We are not yet finished with this strange royal dream. But for now, let the symbols linger. Even as kings and queens dazzled their courts in robes of gold and performed rituals of divine authority, they were never truly alone. Behind every silken curtain, just beyond the bejeweled throne, there stood another world. A world of silent glances, whispered orders, and subtle movements, the intricate web of royal servants and attendants who kept the court's grand illusion alive. Here, in the shadows of power, hierarchy ruled just as fiercely, if not more so, than in the public stage. And among these roles, status wasn't about wealth or titles, but about proximity to the royal body. The closer one stood to the monarch, the more important one became. There was no better example of this than the infamous Groom of the Stool. The title, odd as it may sound to modern ears, was one of the most coveted positions in Tudor England. His job, to assist the king during moments of royal relief. But it was more than just wiping. It was intimacy, trust, a man who saw the king at his most vulnerable and was trusted with the sort of secrets only whispered in tiled chambers. Far from being a lowly servant, the Groom of the Stool often became one of the monarch's closest advisers. He managed private correspondence, dictated access to the king, and was often given lavish gifts. In this strange geometry of courtly service, even excrement translated into influence. Elsewhere in the palace, another critical figure hovered near every meal, the royal food taster. His role was part ritual, part necessity, especially in courts rife with plots and poisons. Before a bite touched royal lips, the taster sampled it first. Not a job for the faint of heart. Sometimes multiple tasters were used, each observing the other. There are even tales of monarchs pretending to eat as the tasters watched one another nervously, each wondering who had drawn the short spoon. And there were the keepers of the royal wardrobe, not mere tailors, but archivists of status. Every garment was logged, repaired, perfumed, and stored under careful record. Robes of mourning were not just black, but laced with layers of symbolic thread. The coronation cloak, handled with gloves and hung on sacred hooks. And when a new queen arrived at court, her clothing was often inspected and remade to reflect her new rank. A hem too short or a color too bold could set gossips ablaze. Sleeping arrangements were another layer of courtly control. Monarchs didn't simply retire to bed in solitude. In many courts, the act of going to sleep, the literal closing of the royal eyes, was an event. Attendants helped disrobe the sovereign, turned down the sheets, and sometimes even slept just outside the chamber doors, in case they were needed in the night. The more trusted might sleep in the same room, behind curtains. In Louis XIV's court, the king's lever rising and couture going to bed were both elaborate ceremonies attended by dozens of nobles, each hoping to hand him a sleeve or a stocking. Anything to be seen, anything to earn favor. Then came the cupbearers, often young, handsome nobles or favored courtiers. They served wine to the monarch, but their position was not just aesthetic. Being a cupbearer placed one within arm's reach of the throne during banquets and negotiations. They heard whispers others could not. They read faces while refilling goblets. A good cupbearer was part diplomat, part bodyguard, part therapist. In the Chinese imperial court, eunuchs held vast influence behind the scenes. Though they were barred from having families, their unique status allowed them into places where no other men were allowed, like the quarters of the empress and concubines. Some eunuchs became power brokers, manipulating court affairs, collecting bribes, and controlling access to the emperor himself. They were feared and despised, but also essential. They knew everyone's secrets. One of the strangest roles was found in some Indian and Persian courts. The royal whisperers, these men or women, were charged with communicating sensitive matters discreetly. They whispered messages between royals and favorites, sometimes speaking so softly that only the intended ear could catch the words. In highly ritualized courts, where every gesture was watched, whisperers were a lifeline to privacy and subterfuge. But not all servants were silent. Some were performers in disguise. Dwarfs, jesters, and fools entertained monarchs not just with jokes, but with biting satire. Their laughter was a mask behind which truth was told. A fool could say things that would get any other courtier exiled or worse. In this way, they were not simply entertainers, but social safety valves, releasing pressure in a tightly wound court. Even those charged with cleaning had hierarchy. There were silver scullery maids, responsible only for utensils of the nobility. Others cleaned boots, but only specific types. A bootmaid who accidentally polished the wrong nobleman's footwear might be dismissed for overstepping her rank. And don't forget the royal wet nurses, especially for queens who gave birth. These women often became influential figures, future kings and queens, offering maternal care and receiving lifelong pensions. In some cases, the children grew more attached to their nurse than to their own royal parents, creating complicated emotional entanglements that echoed through dynasties. Some royal servants were chosen for their appearance. In Renaissance Italy, beautiful men and women were kept as chamber attendants, part eye candy, part conversation piece. They moved through salons in embroidered silks, serving fruit and wine, their very presence an extension of the monarch's taste and refinement. The power of touch was sacred. A servant allowed to touch the king's garments, or even to hold the royal staff, had prestige. Others might live for years in the palace and never speak a word directly to the monarch. Their service was silent, performed like choreography in the background of history. Children were often brought into court service early. Pages and valets were selected from noble families and groomed for higher service. They carried messages, assisted knights, and learned courtly etiquette. One wrong move, one poorly timed word, and their prospects could vanish. But loyalty and silence, that could open every door. Court life was not just about feasts and politics, it was about watching, knowing who stood where, who carried what, who was allowed to speak, and who never looked up from the floor. Power was not just spoken, it was measured in footsteps and glances. There were codes within codes. A flick of a hand might summon a servant to retrieve a love letter. A dropped napkin might signal embarrassment. In some royal households, rules dictated which side of a hallway servants could walk on, and who had to turn their back when the monarch passed. This hidden world of service wasn't merely about logistics, it was about control. By surrounding themselves with attendants, performing specific, often bizarre tasks, monarchs reminded everyone, including themselves, that they were not like other people. They were above, elevated, maintained by a system of invisible scaffolding that ran on silence, precision, and the steady heartbeat of duty. And so, while kings and queens shone like stars at the center of the court, the constellations around them were composed of servants, silent, swift, and strange. They moved like shadows, spoke like ghosts, and kept the palace alive long after the monarch's voice had faded into sleep. If servants whispered in the hallways of royal palaces, then the kitchens echoed with their own secret rhythms, metal against wood. The hiss of steam, the slap of dough against the marble table. Beneath towering feasting halls and behind silken draperies, fires were always lit and pots never still. For in royal courts, food was never just nourishment. It was theatre. It was politics. It was magic. And sometimes it was strange. A royal feast could be a declaration of war or peace, an announcement of marriage, or a quiet reminder of power. Monarchs didn't just dine. They performed their right to rule with every bite. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans, gilded peacocks, pies that banyas, real birds, were sometimes baked alive into pastries so they'd fly out when the crust was cut, to gasps and cheers. But not everyone was allowed at the table. Hierarchy extended to the dining room. In many courts, only nobles of a certain rank could sit within arm's length of the king. The closer you sat, the more favour you had. And then there were those forbidden to eat entirely certain servants, musicians, even royal jesters who played, sang, or juggled throughout the meal, but never touched the food. Food wasn't just arranged for beauty, but for symbolism. In Tudor England, meat pies shaped like castles or boars were served to suggest strength and protection. A fish moulded into the shape of a dolphin might honor a visiting French noble. Every ingredient, every garnish, could carry layers of meaning. A cherry on a tart wasn't just decoration, it might represent chastity or wealth, depending on the guest list. In the Byzantine court, there were feasts where no words were spoken at all. Silent meals meant to display the emperor's stoicism and divine composure. Food was served in silence, eyes down, silver dishes passed by gloved attendants in a choreography of reverence. And then there were the forbidden foods, garlic. In some medieval courts, it was banned before state meetings for its supposed vulgar scent. Certain fish, like eels, were considered aphrodisiacs and thus avoided during religious observances. Some queens avoided strawberries entirely, fearing they caused fainting spells, while others believed they warded off poison. Speaking of poison, let's not forget the golden rule of royal dining. Trust no dish. Tasters tested each bite, but even then, monarchs relied on ritual protections. Plates were made of silver not just for beauty, but because it was believed silver tarnished when touched by poison. Goblets were filled only from specific jugs, sometimes sealed in wax. In Russia, Tsars had entire feasts prepared in duplicate, one for display and one for eating, swapped at the last minute. Meanwhile, rituals around food were sometimes downright bizarre. In France, a royal newborn's first meal might include a drop of wine and a sliver of roasted lamb to bless their taste. In Japanese courts, rice was pressed into tiny animal shapes and arranged in circles to bring fortune. In ancient Persia, only the king could taste a certain melon said to bring dreams of divine guidance. But there were darker customs too. Feasts could be political traps. In some Renaissance Italian courts, guests invited to a sumptuous meal never returned, having been handed poisoned figs or sweetmeats laced with mercury. Hospitality, it seemed, could be lethal. And still, kings ate with splendor. In medieval Scandinavia, Viking descended monarchs dined with shields behind them, not for decor, but defense. Wine was poured into massive horns, and roasted elk ribs were passed by torchlight. Meat was not carved by the king, but by his most trusted advisor, who'd slice and serve with precision, part butler, part bodyguard. Even table manners could be weapons of control. In Louis XIV's Versailles, forks were placed at precise angles, napkins folded like swans. A courtier caught using the wrong spoon might find themselves uninvited the next day. And if one dared speak before the king lifted his cup, silence would follow, the kind that ends careers. Then there were the feasts that never happened. Royal weddings where the bride's court refused to eat, protesting the union through hunger. State dinners where a single spilled cup meant cancellation, a sign from the heavens that the union was doomed. In some parts of medieval India, a monarch might fast for days before battle, surrounded by platters he wouldn't touch, forwarding his restraint as proof of virtue. But not all courts were austere. In Moorish Spain, sultans dined under perfumed canopies, eating honeyed almonds and saffron rice, while poets recited verses between courses. Their dishes were designed to cool the body, calm the mind, and open the senses, an early form of culinary mindfulness. And in West Africa's royal courts, Kings were known to share meals with griot storytellers who would recount the court's deeds between bites. A meal wasn't just consumption, it was legacy, legend, and living history, spoken in rhythm with the scraping of spoons. Desserts carried stories to dot in the Ottoman court. Rosewater confections were layered like silk and eaten only on Fridays after prayers. In France, sugar sculptures taller than a man graced banquet tables crumbling slowly through the evening, a reminder of the fleeting nature of wealth and glory. Some royal kitchens had their own alchemists, people who blended spice with perfume, who turned pomegranate seeds into crimson syrup and pine resin into chewing gum. They kept secrets of preservation, fermentation, and the sacred art of keeping meat sweet through winter. And when feasts were over, rituals continued. The king might walk the hall, offering crusts to beggars at the gate, whether as charity or performance. No one dared ask. Leftovers were tallied, redistributed, and sometimes locked away for fear of theft or sorcery. Food, in royal courts, was not about fullness. It was about power, about performance. It whispered of conquest and custom, of love and loathing. To eat at the king's table was to step into a delicate dance. One misstep, and you might be left holding your fork in silence. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might smell the spicy cinnamon, clove, pepper from faraway ports. Hear the laughter echoing off stone. See the flicker of torchlight on gold-rimmed plates. It wasn't just a meal. It was a message. And in those gilded messages, hidden beneath layers of pastry and ritual, lay a truth that courts never said aloud. To dine with power was to taste the divine. By the time the last goblet was drained and the final sonnet had echoed through the palace hallways, there remained one curtain no monarch, no matter how powerful, could avoid: death. And in the strange, wondrous, and ritual-heavy world of ancient, royal courts, death was not simply an end. It was a final performance. For a king or queen, dying was as choreographed as living. It began not with silence, but with sounder, bell tolling low across the rooftops, a hush spreading like smoke. Attendants who had once dressed the monarch in silk, now dressed their body in linen, sometimes gold thread. The royal corpse, in many courts, was not hidden. It was displayed, glorified, watched. In France, Louis XIV lay in state like a sleeping statue, his slippers embroidered with suns, his scepter nestled beside wax-pale hands. People came not just to mourn, but to see, to remember, to absorb a glimpse of divinity before it slipped into soil. Other monarchs were less serene. In 17th-century Russia, Tsar Ivan the Terrible's body was so infused with spices and vinegar that it emitted a stinging aroma, as if the body itself was still raging. In ancient Egypt, though not a medieval kingdom, the tradition carried into the Byzantine imagination. Death could be elaborate, eternal, and intimately staged. But let's stay in medieval Europe, where good death was not about peace alone, it was about symbolism. Take, for instance, Edward the Confessor, said to have predicted his death and prepared his tomb with almost obsessive precision. His passing was treated not just as a spiritual transition, but a political relay. His bedchamber became a courtroom, his breath a whisper of new succession. It wasn't just mourning, it was maneuvering. And then there were the omens. If a candle sputtered while a monarch lay ill, it might mean death was near. If a raven landed on the palace walls, scribes took note. In some courts, seers and astrologers were consulted, their charts cross-examined with scripture and weather. And what of the funerals themselves? These were operas in procession. In England, Royal bodies were paraded through streets in glass-topped carriages or richly draped wagons pulled by white horses. In some Italian duchies, the body was carried 3 times around the cathedral before entering, symbolizing birth, life, and transcendence. But not all funerals ended at the grave. In Aragon, a monarch might be symbolically recrowned on their deathbed, as if reminding the heavens of their divine right. In Hungary, kings were sometimes buried with 2 swords, one real, one ceremonial, signifying the balance between rule and faith. Then there were the truly strange. In 14th century Bohemia, the court of King Wenceslas required that the king's heart and stomach be buried in different chapels. A final gesture of compartmentalized legacy, body here, love there, power somewhere else. Like a jigsaw of identity only divine beings could reassemble. And let us not forget the tombs. The tombs, some monarchs spent decades designing their final resting places, commissioning artisans to carve likenesses in marble or brass. These weren't graves, they were narratives in stone. Queen Eleanor of Castile's tombs featured effigies so lifelike her husband, Edward I, allegedly knelt and wept at each one. In Spain, royal tombs sometimes included painted wooden carvings of the deceased in full armor, asleep, with swords resting across their chests. In Burgundy, mourners were sculpted into the 2 miniature monks cast in prayer beneath the stone bed, forever grieving. And in England, the heart of Richard the Lionheart was buried in Rouen, his body in Fontevraud Abbey, and his entrails in yet another location. Kings, it seems, couldn't settle even in death. Some royal courts took it a step further. In the Ming court of China, nobles and officials were sometimes buried with scrolls of their accomplishments in case they needed to present a resume in the afterlife. In certain Indian courts, kings were cremated with royal garments, musical instruments, even food provisions for the journey ahead. There were also symbolic marriages after death. In remote parts of medieval Europe and Asia, a deceased prince might be symbolically wed to a living noblewoman to solidify alliances. A ghost groom, a political phantom. And then sainthood. Some monarchs died so devoutly, or at least were rumored to, that they were posthumously sainted. Louis IX of France, Edward the Confessor. Their tombs became shrines, their deaths lessons, their lives rewritten into scripture and legend. But not every royal body was left to rest. In Westminster Abbey, some tombs were opened centuries later by curious archaeologists or ambitious kings. The bones of Richard III, for instance, were unearthed in a Leicester parking lot, having long left their royal cradle. Even in death, kings wander. And still, the pageantry continued. Wakes were held with riddles, songs, and allegories. Some Scottish funerals included jesters reciting the monarch's misdeeds, laughing through tears as if daring death itself to blush. In others, relics of the king like a ring or lock of hair were sent to monasteries as sacred keepsakes. And what of royal animals? Horses that had carried kings in battle were buried with honors. In Hungary, dogs were sometimes interred beside queens. Falcons had their own graves. These weren't pets. They were extensions of legacy. But amid all the gold, incense, and solemn procession, the quietest moments were perhaps the most profound. A chambermaid brushing a monarch's cold hand one last time, a scribe writing the final line in the book of days. A candle lit, not for ceremony, but for memory. Because, for all their power, for all their strangeness and spectacle, royals were still human. They feared the dark. They hoped for peace. They believed that beyond the curtains, somewhere past the incense and bells, there was something waiting. Not a throne, not a crown, but a rest. And so, with this final story of silken shrouds and golden coffins, we end our wander through the peculiar corridors of ancient royal courts. If your eyes are heavy now, if your thoughts drift like incense curling toward high stone ceilings, then let them go. Let the echoes fade. The feasts are done. The torches low dot sleep, dear listener, as the ancients once did under carved stars, in hush and reverence. Good night.